particular put together an outstanding team of scientists to engage and answer these questions. And a lot of those people became part of his ultimate policy team, like Steve Chu, Jane Lubchenco, and John Holdren, among others. Marcia McNutt was also a supporter, and Harold Varmus was a huge supporter of science debate. And for the first time, a president went into office with a fairly well-formed science policy and a good idea of how that fits strategically in with the rest of, in this case, his objectives. So it can have a profoundly important effect, even if it doesn't hit a home run and we don't get a nationally televised science debate. Those incremental moves, getting a person on base and then moving them forward one base at a time, are really important to the discussion because the stakes are so high. So what I wanted to do was introduce Cheryl and Darlene. Would you guys come up? So these guys were, along with me, were half of the early team of science debate. And so what we wanted to do is have a discussion with you guys about how can this be, how can we re-energize this? How is it different? How must it be different with an incumbent president and a challenger versus an open seat? What new tools are there available to us now to get this conversation out there to the next level? And what strategies do you guys think we should be employing in order to move the ball forward? So, back there first, and then Greg. And then,
I'm from the Australian government. I do public awareness for nano and biotechnology, but one of the projects we're doing right now is kind of countering a lot of the craft science that is out there. We're working with the chief scientist of Australia on this. We have an education resource, and we just developed one on critical thinking, and that's on high school. But two of the things that we're producing more for the general public is there's a series of videos on YouTube that is basically how to identify crappy arguments, how to create better arguments yourself. So it's kind of like we say in the office, it's the bullshit detector guide, basically. So it's starting right from scratch. It's starting logic, false evidence, that sort of stuff. And it's all done in a very kind of fuzzy, informative way. And we're also going to be making later in the year a kind of a handbook guide for general public distribution and consumption. It's kind of a tricky one to make because it's balanced between a very boring book about logic and some kind of curious rant about how the Australian government thinks you should think. So we're really playing with the text right now, but we've gone straight to the very start of how to spot crappy arguments. I mean, that kind of ignores the whole issue here about, existing politics and prejudices, but it's kind of asks people to have a closer think about complicated issues. When usually they'll just go for the gut reaction.
right, critical thinking versus truthiness.
I think that also touches on a really interesting and important part of this conversation, which is the most challenging issues in the U.S. aren't necessarily the same conversation happening in other parts of the world.
Right.
We recently hosted 4 European fellows in Austin, Texas, to give them a sense of local government and other policies. And so I set up a meeting with a Democratic state rep, one of the Republican organizers of the local convention, and the founder of the Texas Tea Party, who's a really interesting person that I don't get along with very well. But the point was to expose them to what the conversation's like. And they were honestly pretty horrified. And granted, they were hearing very polarized perspectives, and it was a lot of political jargon, and it was a lot of kind of nudging each other. But at the same time, the person who was from the Tea Party specifically was very prepared with his key points to try to make things sound overly convoluted and to really drive home that, things are uncertain. And he's like, I ended up arguing with him more than anyone, which I shouldn't have, but he's like, have you been to the Arctic? Have you seen it melting? Are you out there? Do weathermen get it right? And he had all of his points down. They were all wrong. And me a thing about why oceans were turning less basic. But the point is that the folks from Europe were kind of like, why are you Americans so crazy? But at the same time, they were so anti-science on things like genetically modified foods that they're eating already and they're not maybe as aware of. And so I do think, and I've gone on a bit of a tangent, but aside from that, I do think it's important to sort of look at this nationally and particularly with the upcoming U.S. election, but also take a broader perspective and think about why the motivating factors in different parts of the world are so different and what's worked elsewhere that maybe hasn't been as effective here.
Who funds what you're doing?
Sorry?
Is it the government that funds your work?
Yeah, I'm with the government.
Greg?
At the other end of the spectrum, from where Cheryl's just talking, right now in the U.S. we are choosing our candidates at the party level right now. And so what I did was I looked around the candidates or whatever my district, my own congressional district, as a scientist and a science writer, I found one who is a biologist and a chemist and an LGBTQIA advocate and a women's rights advocate and a progressive liberal Democrat African American candidate. And I'm now, giving her as much time as possible to volunteer for her campaign, as in relation to not just stuffing envelopes, but actually helping, getting her to have lunch with Shawn at some point soon, hopefully, and making her read his book, and so getting the campaign prepared with the idea that actually the actual possibility of her making not just agreeing to a debate in science. She wants to run a science campaign, okay, and she will actually get up and make speeches in which she brings in the importance of science and policy making. That's what she wants to do as a candidate, and she actually is she'll probably be our congressional candidate for the Democratic Party. They listed with Michelle Bachmann-Plum. So this is the only chance we have of beating someone that she could actually end up being in Congress. In other words, everybody here who's living in the U.S. has the opportunity to help influence. If there's an opportunity, just go and check. And if you haven't checked, you're going to feel pretty bad later if you find out that there was a candidate you could have gone and helped. And it was a biologist.
Sometimes that sharp contrast can work. I'm sorry, blanking on his name right now. Physicist that won in Denny Hastert old seat. One of my. Yeah,
Bill Foster.
Yeah, or Bill Foster. Yeah. And so that was a Republican-leaning district, a lot of evangelical voters, but it was swingy enough that he could, by motivating his base and the moderate swing vote of science, he was able to actually get in there for a
In this
term.
particular district, the main industry in this district happens to be Cargill and Pillsbury, right? Food. I mean, there's a science-based related agro industry.
Yep. We had some.
Yeah, so I'd like to throw in a question from the other side, and please forgive me. I only had a couple of days to read your book before I came over here to listen to you. You don't tackle so much the questions of why people aren't involved in science. Science used to be a big thing in the USA. You do describe in your book a bit how scientists themselves withdrew a bit from the general population. They isolated, they marginalized themselves while believing that they were making themselves the elite. But if you'll forgive me, I did not see anything in your book, for example, of when the public gets it right and when science gets it wrong, so to speak. For example, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. I was quite surprised you didn't cover that in your book, because you're talking there about issues about personal autonomy, personal authenticity, and that still bears on your problems today. A lot of people are rejecting science because they think it's threatening their authenticity or their autonomy.
I didn't get into that in the book. I didn't cover those two specific examples, which are more ethical than political, and many of them didn't really actually come to light until much later. But I do talk about how, particularly around environmental issues, the public became suspicious of science. There's a lot of things in the book and I don't want to spend most time talking about the book, but essentially science began to diverge from business interests in the 1970s. Before that, science was really the way forward, propelling commerce, propelling invention, propelling opportunity through business. As the environmental movement grew, environmental science grew, aspects of climate science began to become well-known, and environmental effects of past scientific advances, for instance, DDT in bald eagles, the national symbol, Island. It was just Love Canal, disaster after disaster after disaster was associated with science, and often with ambiguous moral consequences that constantly reminded people of the ambiguous moral consequences of the bomb. And so the public's attitude began to diverge and become much more suspicious of science. But like I said, again, I'd much rather get your opinions about science debate right now than, yes?
Maybe, I'm curious, do you share my optimism about this year's science debate efforts? Because, as I mentioned before, there was very little conflict in 2008 on some of these fundamental questions. There is going to be conflict this year. And is that something we can take advantage, or is there a bad, is there really a dark side to that in maybe exaggerating the already polarized nature of the public discourse?
Well, that's my biggest concern, and I do share your opinion that the media is probably much more interested in the topic this time around because they do see it as a conflict. And as to the question of whether or not it will further polarize it, I think that it has to do with how it's executed. It can, but I think that we have to be careful not to present science as a partisan issue. It is a political issue, but it's not a partisan issue. And there are some different, we've had some discussions in conference calls about different formats. One format that we like so far is a Charlie Rose style roundtable with the candidates and an interviewer on these issues. So it's immediately it's a more thoughtful, deliberative setting. It's not standing up and doing a performance behind a podium. Then follow that up with a post-game analysis, so to speak, bringing in leading scientists, science writers, and assess how well the candidates really did in grounding their arguments in reality versus rhetoric. And rather than what we see right now, which is the partisan talking heads from one side or the other, emphasize the vertical access instead of the horizontal, if you will, on it. So that's kind of the development of our thinking so far. Maybe you guys have other suggestions on how we can do that.
And just to add to that, also broadening public participation early on, so it's not seen as a